The morning my father's will was read, I was the only one who cried, not because I was devastated, not because I was surprised, but because I had known for 3 years, 3 long, quiet years of driving him to chemotherapy in Mississauga, of sleeping on a fold-out cot in his guest room when his hands shook too badly to hold a glass of water, of learning the difference between a bad night and a genuinely dangerous one. I had known this moment would come, and I still wasn't ready for it. My father died on a Tuesday in late February, the kind of gray, indifferent Tuesday that Canada specializes in. There was a thin layer of ice on the driveway of his house in Burlington when I pulled in, and I remember thinking I should salt it before I left, because old habits don't die just because the person you formed them around does. He had a nice house. Not extravagant, my father wasn't that kind of man, but solid. A 4-bedroom colonial with a finished basement and a backyard that backed onto a conservation trail. He'd bought it in 1989 for $240,000 and had owned it outright since 2011. In the current market, it was worth somewhere between 1.1 and 1.3 million, depending on which realtor you asked. I knew this because my father had told me. Sitting at his kitchen table 6 months before he died, his reading glasses perched on his nose and his tea going cold beside him, he had walked me through every asset he owned. The house, the RRSP, the TFSAs, the small investment portfolio his financial advisor at TD had been managing for 15 years. The life insurance policy he'd kept current since my mother left in 2003. He told me I was the sole beneficiary of all of it. And then he made me promise not to tell my brother. I kept that promise right up until the moment the estate lawyer, a measured man named Mr. Ashworth, who worked out of an office on Brant Street, sat down with the 3 of us and read the will aloud. My brother had driven up from Hamilton with his wife. They sat across from me at the conference table, and I remember noticing that his wife was wearing a blazer I'd seen her post about on Instagram the previous month. She'd tagged the boutique in Oakville and called it an investment piece. She had not, as far as I knew, invested any time in visiting my father over the preceding 3 years. I had counted her visits on one hand, with fingers to spare. My brother's name is not one I say easily anymore, so I'll call him what he is to me now, my brother. He was 42 at the time. He managed a mid-size HVAC company in Hamilton and earned good money and liked to remind people of this in subtle ways. The watch, the truck, the way he picked up restaurant bills with a kind of performance that suggested the gesture cost him nothing when in fact it was precisely calculated to cost him exactly as much as it needed to in order to produce the desired effect. He had not driven my father to chemotherapy. Not once. When Mr. Ashworth finished reading, the room was quiet for about 4 seconds. Then my brother said, "That's not right." Mr. Ashworth looked at him over his glasses. "I'm sorry?" "That's not right," my brother said again, slower, this time, as though repetition would produce a different document. "There must be an older version. He must have meant to update it." His wife put her hand on his arm, not to comfort him. I know this because I know her, and that gesture, hand on arm, light pressure, eyes forward, is the one she uses when she's telling him to slow down. Not because he's wrong, but because he's being visible. "The will was executed 14 months ago," Mr. Ashworth said. "It was witnessed and notarized. Mr. Hargrove was assessed as having full testamentary capacity at the time of signing." Hargrove. That was my father's name, Kenneth Hargrove. He was 68 years old when he died, and he had known exactly what he was doing. My brother looked at me across the table. I looked back. "You knew," he said. I didn't answer. "You knew and you didn't tell me." Dad asked me not to. His wife made a small sound that was not quite a laugh. "Of course he did." We did not hug goodbye in the parking lot. The calls started 3 days later. First, it was my brother, with a tone I recognized from childhood. The reasonable voice, the one he used when he wanted something and had decided that appearing calm was the fastest route to getting it. He said he just wanted to talk. He said he wasn't angry. He understood Dad had been unwell. He understood that medications could affect a person's thinking. He said maybe we should look into it together as a family, whether the will really reflected what Dad would have wanted if he'd been in his right mind. I told him Dad had been in his right mind. I told him I had been there. I told him that if he had concerns he should speak to Mr. Ashworth. He said he would. Then his wife called. Her voice was different, warmer, almost fond, which was how I knew she'd been practicing. She said she hoped there were no hard feelings. She said she knew this had been a difficult time for everyone. She said that my brother was really struggling, that he and Dad had had a complicated relationship. She was sure I understood, and that sometimes grief makes people say things they don't mean. I said I understood. She said she was glad. Then she said, very gently, very carefully, that it seemed like a big house for one person to manage, especially given my work schedule, and had I thought about what I was going to do with it. There it was. I told her I was going to live in it. The warmth drained out of her voice immediately. Not completely, she was too controlled for that, but enough that the remaining degrees felt calculated rather than genuine. She said she hoped I'd thought it through carefully. She said the carrying costs on a house like that could be significant. She said property taxes in Halton region had gone up substantially. She said, and this was the part that stayed with me, your father worked very hard for that house and we just want to make sure it's being respected. We, as though she had been there. As though the two of them had sat with him through the bad weeks, had learned which anti-nausea medication worked and which one made things worse, had called the oncology nurse at 11 at night because his temperature had spiked, and the discharge paperwork said to call if it went above 38.5. I thanked her for her concern and ended the call. That evening, I drove to my father's house. My house now, though it didn't feel like it yet, and sat in his kitchen and drank tea out of his mug and tried to figure out what came next. What came next arrived in an envelope. 41 days after my father's death, I received a letter from a law firm in downtown Hamilton. My brother, acting through his solicitor, was formally contesting the will on the grounds of undue influence. The claim was that I had exploited my position as my father's primary caregiver to pressure him into changing his estate documents in my favor. I sat with that letter for a long time, then I called my own lawyer. Her name is Ms. Oduya, and she practices estate litigation out of an office near Appleby Go Station. She had been recommended to me by a colleague at work 6 months earlier, back when my father first started talking to me about the will, and I'd had the quiet, uncomfortable sense that I should be prepared. I had retained her back then, just in case. I had paid her retainer out of my own savings, not my father's. I had not mentioned this to my brother. Miss Oduya read the letter and told me the claim was common, that it was frequently used as a pressure tactic by disappointed beneficiaries, and that it had a low rate of success when the testator, the person who made the will, had been properly assessed and documented at the time of signing. She asked me what documentation existed. I told her about Mr. Ashworth, about the capacity assessment, about the notes my father's oncologist had provided confirming cognitive function, about the fact that my father had, 3 days before signing the updated will, handwritten a 2-page letter to his lawyer explaining his reasoning. Miss Oduya was quiet for a moment. "Did you know about the letter?" she asked. "He told me he'd written something," I said. "He didn't tell me what was in it." "Have you read it?" "No, I'll request a copy from Mr. Ashworth," she said. "But what you're describing sounds like a man who anticipated this challenge and prepared for it." He had. That was exactly what he had done. Because he knew his son, because he had watched his son for 42 years and understood precisely how he operated and had loved him anyway and had still made the choice he made. I cried again that night. Different kind of crying. My brother escalated the week after his lawyer sent the letter. He started calling my father's neighbors, people who had known our family for 20 years, asking if they had noticed anything unusual in my father's behavior in the last year of his life. Whether I had seemed to be controlling, whether Dad had seemed isolated. I found out because one of those neighbors, a woman named Mrs. Calloway, who had brought soup to my father's door every other week during his treatment, called me directly. "I told him your father seemed peaceful," she said, "and that you were there constantly and that he always spoke about you with, I don't know how else to say it, with relief. Like he wasn't afraid of what was coming because you were handling it." I thanked her. She told me she'd said the same thing to whatever junior associate my brother had hired to make those calls, and that she'd also told them she found the whole thing distasteful. I loved Mrs. Calloway, but the calls to neighbors were just the beginning. The following week, my brother filed an emergency application in Ontario Superior Court requesting that the estate be frozen pending the outcome of his challenge. The practical effect of this, if granted, would be that I couldn't access the bank accounts my father had transferred to me, couldn't list the Burlington house as my residence for mortgage purposes, and couldn't make any decisions about the estate assets while the litigation proceeded, which my brother's lawyer helpfully noted could take anywhere from 18 months to 3 years. The night I got that news, I sat on my father's back porch in the cold, wrapped in a blanket that still smelled faintly like him, and I let myself feel how unfair it was. Fully, without editing it. I had given 3 years of my life. I had been there. I had done the thing that needed doing, not because I expected to be compensated for it, but because he was my father and he was scared and I was the one who showed up. And now the person who hadn't shown up was using the legal system to punish me for exactly that. I gave myself 1 hour on that porch. Then I went inside and called Ms. Oduya. The hearing for the freeze application was scheduled for a Thursday morning at the courthouse in Milton. I arrived early. My brother and his wife arrived together, and she was wearing the Oakville blazer again. The judge who heard the application was a woman with short gray hair and the particular stillness of someone who has seen a great many people behave badly under financial stress and has long since stopped being surprised by it. She listened to both sides. She asked several questions. At one point, she asked my brother's lawyer what specific evidence existed of undue influence, and the lawyer outlined the theory that my position as caregiver had given me disproportionate access and control, that my father had been weakened by illness, that the change in beneficiary from equal shares to sole inheritance constituted a suspicious departure from his prior wishes. Then the judge asked whether there was documentation of my father's capacity and reasoning at the time of signing. My lawyer presented 3 things. The first was the capacity assessment from my father's GP, completed 2 weeks before the will was signed, noting no evidence of cognitive impairment. The second was a letter from his oncologist, dated the same month, stating that while my father was undergoing treatment for stage 3 colorectal cancer, his mental acuity remained unaffected. The third was the letter my father had written by hand to his estate lawyer. Mr. Ashworth had released a copy to Ms. Oduya. I had read it for the first time the night before the hearing, sitting at my father's kitchen table, in the same chair where he had walked me through his assets 14 months ago. He had written in his careful, slightly formal handwriting that he was of sound mind and that he wished the record to reflect the reasons for his decision. He wrote that he had one daughter who had been present throughout the worst experience of his life, who had set aside her own needs to be with him, who had never asked for anything in return. He wrote that he had one son who was capable and successful and who he was confident would be fine. He wrote that what he was leaving me was not a reward, but an acknowledgement, that the person who stays deserves to know that it was seen. He had written, "I do not want there to be any confusion after I am gone about whether I knew what I was doing. I did. I have never been more certain of anything." The judge read the letter in full. When she looked up, she denied the freeze application. She also noted, for the record, that the evidence of undue influence presented was entirely theoretical, that the documentation of testamentary capacity was thorough and consistent, and that the court would look dimly on attempts to use procedural mechanisms to delay the administration of a validly executed estate. My brother's wife was very still on the way out. My brother did not look at me. He didn't drop the challenge. I want to be honest about this because I think there's a version of this story where the denied freeze application is the turning point and everything resolves cleanly after that. It didn't. My brother refiled through a different angle. His lawyer argued that my father's handwritten letter itself was evidence of my influence, that it was too articulate, too organized, too precisely constructed to have been written independently by an ill man. They hired a forensic document examiner. I am not going to pretend the next 4 months were fine. They weren't. The legal costs were significant. I was working full-time, managing an estate in active litigation, and living in a house that still didn't feel like mine, surrounded by my father's things, fielding calls from my lawyer every other week with updates I didn't want but needed. My brother called twice during this period. Once to tell me there was still time to settle, that he would accept 30% of the estate value in cash and drop everything. Once to tell me, the night before a mediation session that had been ordered by the court, that he hoped I understood that what I had done to our family was unforgivable. I did not respond to either call. The mediation session was 4 hours in a beige room in downtown Burlington, a court-appointed mediator. Both lawyers, my brother and his wife on one side of the table, me on the other. The mediator asked what outcome would feel acceptable to both parties. My brother said he wanted to be treated fairly by his own family. I said I wanted what my father had decided to give me. We did not reach a settlement. 3 weeks after mediation failed, Ms. Oduya called me on a Wednesday afternoon. She told me that the forensic document examiner my brother had hired had submitted their report. The report concluded that the handwriting in my father's letter was consistent with his known writing samples, showed no signs of having been produced under duress or external direction, and reflected a cognitive fluency consistent with the GP's capacity assessment. It was, in short, entirely his own. My brother's case had just lost its central pillar. His lawyer contacted Ms. Oduya the following Monday. They wanted to discuss terms. Ms. Oduya called to tell me what they were offering, $75,000 from estate assets, to be treated as an advance bequest in exchange for withdrawal of the challenge. I asked Ms. Oduya what she thought. She said it was my decision entirely, but that our litigation position was strong, that the challenge was likely to be dismissed if it went to trial, and that a trial would cost both sides significantly more than $75,000. I sat with it for 2 days, then I called Ms. Oduya and gave her my answer. No, I said no, not because of the money. Not because I couldn't have used $75,000 in legal fees and lost sleep and month after month of living in a house I loved but couldn't quite settle into, but because my father had written a letter. He had sat at his kitchen table, unwell and exhausted and entirely clear-eyed, and he had written down exactly what he wanted and why. He had anticipated this challenge. He had prepared for it. He had trusted that it would be enough. I was not going to let his brother, my brother, buy his way out of that for $75,000 and call it even. Miss Oduya said she understood. She said she would communicate our positions. The trial date was set for September. In July, something happened that my brother had not anticipated. Mrs. Calloway, the neighbor who had brought my father soup, contacted Miss Oduya directly. She said she had remembered something, a conversation she'd had with my brother's wife, approximately 2 years before my father died, at a neighborhood barbecue at the house 2 doors down. She said my brother's wife had asked her, casually, whether she knew if Kenneth had a will and whether he'd spoken about his plans for the house. She said she hadn't thought much of it at the time. Families talked about these things, but that in light of everything that had happened, she thought the lawyers should know. Miss Oduya said this was relevant because it suggested my brother and his wife had been aware of estate considerations well before my father's decline, which undermined the claim that their challenge arose from genuine concern about his capacity. She asked if she could take a formal statement from Mrs. Calloway. Mrs. Calloway said yes. I sent her flowers the following week, peonies, because that's what she had in her front garden every summer. She called to thank me and said she thought my father would be proud. I believed her. On the 14th of August, 3 weeks before the trial was scheduled to begin, my brother's lawyer contacted Ms. Oduya with a new proposal. Complete withdrawal of the challenge, no money exchanged. My brother would sign a release acknowledging the validity of the will and relinquishing any further claim on the estate. In exchange, he asked for one thing. He asked that I not pursue costs, legal costs, the fees I had incurred defending a challenge that had been, in Ms. Oduya's professional opinion, unlikely to succeed and pursued longer than it should have been. Ms. Oduya told me I had a reasonable claim to those costs if the matter proceeded to trial and we prevailed. She said the amount would be meaningful. She said it was my call. I thought about my father at his kitchen table, the reading glasses, the cold tea, the way he had looked at me when he finished going through everything, not with guilt, exactly, but with something that wanted to be absolution. He was sorry, I think, that he was leaving me something that would have to be fought for. He had tried to make it clean. He had done everything he could. He would not have wanted me to drag this out any longer than it needed to be. I told Miss Oduya to accept the terms. The withdrawal was filed on 17th of August. The estate was fully administered in October. I live in my father's house now. My house. I put a new mailbox in at the end of November because the old one was starting to rust, and I ordered a specific burgundy color that I knew he would have hated because I needed it to feel like mine, and small acts of personalization are sometimes the only way to take ownership of grief. I still drink tea out of his mug. That part I haven't changed. My brother and I have not spoken since the withdrawal. His wife sent me a text on the day the estate was finalized. 4 words, no punctuation, that I think was meant to be a gesture toward normalcy. I read it twice, and then I set my phone down on the kitchen counter, and I looked out the window at the backyard and the conservation trail beyond it, bare and gray in November the way everything in Ontario is bare and gray in November, and I thought about my father walking that trail in the mornings before he got sick, his coffee in one hand, his headphones in, unbothered. I didn't respond to the text. I don't plan to. There are people who will tell you that family is family, that blood obligates, that forgiveness is something you owe people, regardless of what they've done, because carrying resentment only hurts you. I've heard all of it. I understand philosophical argument. I don't believe it applies universally, and I especially don't believe it applies here. My brother asked a court to decide that my father didn't know his own mind. He hired people to call our neighbors and ask whether I had seemed controlling. He tried to use procedural leverage to freeze me out of the thing my father had spent decades building, had suffered through treatment to preserve, had stayed awake at his kitchen table to carefully and deliberately leave to me. He did all of that not because he was grieving, though I don't doubt he was. He did it because he wanted something he hadn't earned, and had decided that the appropriate response to not getting it was to dismantle everything my father had built instead. I don't owe forgiveness for that. I don't owe anything for that. What I owe is to the man who sat at his kitchen table in Burlington and wrote by hand that the person who stays deserves to know that it was seen. I see it, Dad. I've got the house. I've got the mug. I salted the driveway last February, the morning after the first real freeze, and I stood out there in the cold for a minute longer than I needed to, and looked at the front door and thought, "This is mine. He meant it to be mine. I am going to take care of it." That's what I did. That's what I'm still doing, and I don't need my brother's understanding to do it.